Welcome to Monday, December 2nd, 2024, this Day Weather Podcast, brought to you by Converse County Tourism. Douglas and Glen Rock, Wyoming are bustling with action this holiday season. Plan your excursion, including fun activities, beautiful downtowns, and historic treasures. Learn more at conversecountytourism.com. Well, we're going to see very little in the way of weather as all is quiet across the western United States. Beautiful shot there from Laramie over the holiday period with a little bit of snow on the ground and a lot of color in the sky. But high pressure is not going to allow any Pacific fronts or storms to come into the Rockies. So we're going to just coast through the next 5 days here with really nothing. Very mild December weather, dry conditions, above average temperatures as all the cold and the stormy weather is going to be well to our east, as that's where the cold air and the pattern is going to dictate where the most winter weather is going to be. That'll be in the Great Lakes in the northeastern United States. Now, the pattern is going to change. This pattern will sort of cycle itself through. It takes a good 7 to 10 days for this type of configuration to work itself out before the weather pattern changes again. So we'll just sit back and not have to worry about much. But there's one thing that is coming into play, and this is really true during the winter season and spring seasons, and that is what is called the Madden-Julian oscillation, or what we call the MJO. I'm going to throw a little bit of this at you here at the end of the podcast. If you're interested, stay tuned. Wait till the end. We'll talk a little bit about how this is going to affect us as we go now into the month of December. Beautiful shot there from Fort Laramie, and some interesting clouds in northwest New Mexico. A lot of wave action going on with those clouds as the upper level winds aloft go over the mountainous terrain and cause those wave features. And sometimes you get some very interesting clouds and some high and mid-level clouds as well, as we see there from Weld County, Colorado this weekend. Now, the satellite loop really shows well the high pressure ridge across the west coast, the Pacific Northwest, the desert Southwest, and the Intermountain West. So in this oval here, we just have this upper level low right here causing some high clouds over the Great Basin there, but they're just going to be high level clouds not doing much. We see the storms in Alaska going up and over the ridge. Then the blue shows the cold air heading into the Great Lakes in the northeast. This is the configuration that we're going to have all week. Basically, things are stuck with high pressure in the west, and we're going to see the low pressure in the Great Lakes in the east. And this is where we are today. This is where we're going to be on Thursday. So there's really not too much different going on. This little wave on Thursday, there's a little ripple coming off the Pacific. This will go over the ridge down, and it may bring a cold front. We may see temperatures as we get into Friday and Saturday cool off a bit along and east of the divide. But you're going to have your precipitation and your weather right here and some very chilly, unsettled conditions there across the eastern half of the nation and eastern half of Canada. But we have the configuration right here with the lows here and the lows here and the high here and the high further out in the Atlantic. That's just going to dictate the weather is going to be driven by this pattern, so there's not much going on. This is not a good configuration in the western United States if you want to have some weather. But when we take a look at precipitation and things beyond Friday is when things begin to change. This is the precipitation forecast between today and Friday. So you can see a little bit of rain gets into Washington and Oregon. You can see the gray here in the light green. This is flurries, light snow coming back into the cold of the Midwest. There's the lake effect snow, as some of you probably saw watching football over the weekend, and especially last night in Buffalo. Some rain along the Gulf Coast of Texas, but really the western United States from the high plains, other than the Dakotas and far eastern Montana, there's just going to be no weather this week. Temperature anomalies, that's where the cold's going to be. Look at Florida. Florida very chilly for this time of year. But we've got to see this pattern flip if we want any weather in the west. How does it flip? Well, the jet stream configuration has got to really change. And that's going to take probably 5 or 6 days to happen. And here it is. By Sunday morning, we start to see the low and the big dip out here that's going to be there all week starting to migrate into northeastern areas of Canada. we start to see high pressure now push up into the Gulf of Alaska and high pressure wanting to form here now. So that's more like it in terms of opening the door to colder air and the return of snow back into the western United States. But it's not going to be until Sunday or just after Sunday before that happens. But once it does, we should get back into a more active pattern in the west. This is by next Tuesday. Pretty deep low in the Great Basin states in the desert southwest. Cold air will have easy access back into the Rockies. And here's that configuration we had before the weather got quiet again. High in the southeast, high in the eastern Pacific. So this is a well-known pattern to bring weather back into the west. But for those of you impatiently waiting for the wintry weather to come back, it's going to be 5 or 6 days of waiting. Now let's talk about the Madden-Julian oscillation. Now this is a mouthful. There's a lot going on with this, and I can get really deep into the weeds. But it's something that is really important in terms of trying to see how patterns are going to maybe progress over a 30-plus day period of time. What this circulation, this oscillation is all about is the interaction with the Pacific Ocean and the Indian Oceans in terms of a lot of tropical activity, tropical rainfall, tropical thunderstorm complexes that happen in the Indian Ocean and the Western Pacific. Now, we talk about El Nino and La Nina all the time, and that is part of the puzzle. This is part of the puzzle. With the weather and the climate, it's never one thing. It's multiple things working together. And so you can never just put your finger on one thing and says that this is exactly what's going on. It's a combination of things. And the MJO, we call it, is a cycle that happens with tropical rainfall in the Indian Ocean and the Western Pacific that tends to give us hints of long-term patterns of wetter, drier, colder, or warmer. And we have 8 phases of the MJO, 8 different categories of how it goes. And this is a good way to talk about how it'll go through a cycle. 30 to 60 day cycles overriding on top of your La Nina and El Nino cycles or your neutral cycles with La Nina and El Nino. So there's a lot going on here, but it can be a large overriding factor, a big factor in how patterns will go. And we've just experienced it because we've gone through a different cycle, which is favorable for the central and eastern United States to get cold, while the western United States tends to be warmer and drier. So you have to wait for the next cycle, so to speak, to go through to really drive things on a larger scale across the globe. There's a lot going on here, but I want to show you the phases. So that this graph is, this rectangle here is broken up into 8 different sections right here. So when we say MJO phase 1, that's what we mean. Whoops, it's in that area right there. So let's go back and show you where we are. This shows the forecast of the MJO between November 30th through December 31st. The black line here shows you where it's gone through. And notice it cycles. So it goes from one phase to another over time, and those numbers you see are dates. So we've been cycling through, and where we've been and where we are now is just moving into MJO phase 5. We've cycled through 1, 2, 3, 4, and going back even further, 6, 7, 8. So it goes through a cycle. So what the forecast is for us to be right here going from 4 to 5 into 6 and into 7. So what does that mean? What does a MJO phase from 4 to 7 mean over the next 30 days? Well, what it means is if we look at historical precedents, which is what has happened before, when we go into phases 4, 5, 6, and 7 in the months of December, January, or February, what we're doing is we're entering these phases here. We're going to go into 5, up here, 6, 7 over the next 30 days. And a 5, 6, 7 phase, if you notice, the blue is in the western United States. These are the temperature anomalies. So the temperature anomalies over the next 30 days will trend somewhat into these phases. Not exactly. Don't look at these maps and say, oh, that's exactly what's going to happen. It's what the tendency, it's what the trend is. So the trend after this week is to go to the phases more, let's say, favorable for those of you who like winter weather. This is the precipitation tendency for 5, 6, and 7. Notice for 5, 6, and 7, there's green patches in the Rockies and the western United States. So the Western Pacific and the Indian Ocean tropical phases cycling through the atmosphere, cycling through the northern hemisphere, historically, this is what 5, 6, and 7 tends to do. So the long-range maps that we showed you going back here of things changing by late in the weekend into next week does indicate this matches up well with what's going on in the Pacific with the MJO. But as I mentioned earlier, we have those other phases, those other cycles going on near the equator with La Nina and El Nino. This is where it can get very complicated. There's a lot of moving parts. A lot of these phases are working together or against each other. But the general trend is after this week of warm, dry weather in the west, things should change. At least they should get more active. So we'll see how things go. Have yourself a great Monday. We'll see you tomorrow.